The Projection Booth podcast is sponsored by Scarecrow Video. Try out Scarecrow's rent by mail service. Choose from over 150,000 films and get Blu-rays, 4Ks, and DVDs delivered directly to your door. Visit scarecrow.com today.
Hold your ears, folks. It's showtime.
People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
A mysterious phone call.
Eye, knife, raven, doll, coffin.
A terrible dream.
It seems I was in a graveyard. And then... oh, I can't remember everything.
A psychic investigator.
Mrs. Stanton, the unknown has frightened people since the beginning of time. The only cure is understanding.
Oh, Doctor, I'm trying to understand. Can't you see that? I really am trying to understand.
A family secret.
Someone was playing ESP games with Paul the night of his death.
I don't play games with married men, Luke.
Stefanie Powers stars in Sweet, Sweet Rachel.
I know what you're trying to do, Lillian. It won't work.
Won't it?
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Ms. Amanda Reyes.
Eye, knife, raven, doll, coffin.
Also joining us is Mr. Kendall R. Phillips.
And I have computerized case histories of all these hauntings because that matters for some reason.
We are kicking off Shocktober 2025 with the made-for-TV movie Sweet, Sweet Rachel, the pilot for what would become the TV series The Sixth Sense. It stars Stefanie Powers as the gorgeous Rachel Stanton, whose husband dies under mysterious circumstances. It's a tale of psychic phenomenon and spooky things that we will be spoiling along the way, so if you don't want anything ruined, turn off the podcast and come back after you've seen the film. We will still be here. So, Amanda, when was the first time you saw Sweet, Sweet Rachel, and what did you think?
So this one came to me a little later in life. I think I was alive when it aired, but I would have been like 3 months old or something. So if I saw it, I don't remember. But about 20 years ago or so, when I first started to really get back into TV movies and I was trying to see all the great Gothic early 70s ABC movie of the weeks and stuff, I found a bootleg of it and I put it on. I remember watching it and I actually had stomach poisoning. I had some kind of food poisoning thing and I put it on. And so, of course, it was super surreal. There's a lot of TV movies have a really cinematic sense to them. But Sutton Roley has a really interesting eye, and this is a very dreamlike film. And I think it felt like a fever dream just right when I needed it to. And it was a pretty amazing experience. I really like Sweet Sweet Rachel. I'm not sure it's my favorite of these movies that aired in this era, but it's definitely one that I really enjoy, mostly because of the cast and because I think Sutton Roley does make really interesting films, and he only made a handful of TV movies. And also, I'm a huge, huge fan of Stefanie Powers, and I will pretty much watch her in anything. And yeah, I like it a lot. I think it's and watching it for this, I started to see it in a different way. And hopefully we can talk a little bit. I don't have any answers, but I have a lot of thoughts about this idea of mixing science with the mystical and what that's trying to do. And I think it does a really good job of trying to maybe suggest that there is an intersection between the two.
And Kendall, how about yourself?
I'm a little older than Amanda, but not that much old. So I would have been about 3 when this aired. So if I probably was with a snifter of brandy sitting enjoying this, but I feel like I probably saw this on those late night CBS movie. That's where I first saw Kolchak, which is what got me interested in Sweet Sweet Rachel, is because I was very interested in The Night Stalker and I wrote a book on Kolchak. And then in doing that, I realized that Kolchak really wasn't quite the first, that Sweet Sweet Rachel had beat The Night Stalker to air, and then The Sixth Sense had come out a little bit before Kolchak The Night Stalker. Like Amanda, the best way to watch this is slightly ill or high or something, but it does stand up as really wonderful Gothic tropes, and it really captures that sort of 18th, 19th century Gothic. Is she crazy? Is she not? And I also agree that the mixing of science and spiritualism and grief and mourning, which I think in early 1970s America probably really hit home in unique ways. So yeah, it did stand up for me as well.
Yeah, that's funny. I was just talking about the whole Kubler-Ross thing recently, and the whole idea of death and dying, and how death and dying classes were a thing back in the 70s. I remember my mom taking a class like that. So yeah, the 70s and the late 60s, such a weird void of spiritualism, and then an attempt to get it back, especially with more like new agey kind of stuff. I mean, we did talk a little bit about that in, there's actually a Columbo episode where there's a whole lot of new age stuff. And then, of course, like you're saying, Kolchak, this whole early 70s spookiness that we have, psychic phenomenon. Oddly enough, this reminds me of something from almost 10 years later with The Entity. And that almost seems to be that last little gasp of real psychic versus science kind of stuff, and really trying to prove the psychic powers through the science. I mean, we talked about a film, I think it was either this year or late last year, called Red Lights, where it was all about debunking psychic stuff. And then there was a real psychic, spoiler alert for that one. But yeah, I was completely unfamiliar with this film until you put on my radar. And I really did not watch The Sixth Sense at all. I remember we almost watched it because we were doing a whole podcast series about Night Gallery. And there's this weird thing how they took the 2 seasons, if I'm correct, they took the 2 seasons of Sixth Sense, slapped some Rod Serling intros on there, and made them into Night Gallery episodes for the last 2 seasons, which is just a weird thing that they would do with some of these TV shows, where they were just trying to recycle them in bizarro ways.
They also truncated them. So like the episodes were originally an hour long. So you got these sort of like 25-minute versions of them. And I feel like I've seen them years ago, and they're very confused. And it helps to see them in their full form, because there's other things that they cut out a lot of meat in them. So that was unfortunate. And I think for years, people thought The Sixth Sense was not a worthwhile show, but it's fairly interesting and of historical note, because Joan Crawford's last on-screen appearance was in Dear Joan, We're Going to Scare You to Death, which is an episode of The Sixth Sense directed by John Newland. That's fabulous. So it's like a really interesting show, but I think it had to sit by the wayside for a long time before people realized that what it was really for many years.
What I find interesting, and we'll probably come back and talk about this later, but is the way The Sixth Sense disappears largely from cultural history and television history. And I do feel like Kolchak, the Night Stalker, kind of becomes the epitome, even though it didn't run as long, it was only 20 episodes, but somehow that becomes the epitome of this new horror series as opposed to the earlier anthology series. But The Sixth Sense was actually there earlier, but for whatever set of reasons, it gets forgotten by a lot of folks. And you don't hear people talking about that as one of the pioneering early horror television series. But it is. It was there first, and it does a lot of the things similar to what Kolchak and later Supernatural and Buffy and things like that would do.
Well, you mentioned Sutton, the director, and I didn't realize there was a TV show that he was involved with called Target from 1958, which was a half-hour horror anthology show starring Adolphe Menjou. Speaking of Joan Crawford there. Yeah, I was completely unfamiliar with that one. Now I'm going to have to try to track that down. I did track some episodes of The Sixth Sense down. Wasn't really that impressed. I don't know if it was what it was about it, but I just was not really super into it. I even watched an episode with Shatner, just thinking, okay, if nothing else, this episode has Shatner, so this will really scratch that Shatner itch that I always have. It's like a rash. It's interesting though to see the differences between the series and this movie, and that both of them start with a quote on a wall, like with the introduction of the psychic investigator. And in The Sixth Sense, it's a quote from the Old Testament. And then in Sweet, Sweet Rachel, when we first get introduced to the psychic investigator, there's a placard that says, if I had my life to live over, I should devote myself to psychic research rather than psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud. I'm like, oh, that's a really odd turn to go from Freud to the Old Testament, but I am not sure what to exactly make of that, but it's quite a stark difference for me.
Well, the whole thing was totally revamped. It was like Alex Dreier, I guess, wasn't sexy enough for TV. So they went with Gary Collins, who, don't get me wrong, I love him, and they got rid of the assistant. And they really just changed. So I would never have known that it started as Sweet Sweet Rachel had I not read that somewhere. There's just nothing that connects the two at all. But I guess it's moving with the times, because you're right, it's just right before Kolchak, and where maybe Kolchak, obviously that's a great show, but I think one of the things that makes it rise out and maybe stand out from that era, there were lots of anthology shows like Ghost Story or Circle of Fear, it's known as sometimes, is this idea of that Gary Collins was very dry. And I know Mike and I have talked about this before, but there were the Kolchak movies, and then they tried to rejigger the formula with the Norliss tapes. And I am a big fan of the Norliss tapes, but one of the things that it lacked was that kind of humor that Darren McGavin had. And the Norliss tapes is often considered at the end. Like if you were to list your favorite kind of Kolchak movies and put that on the list somewhere, people were going to put the Norliss tapes third sometimes. It was almost right on the cusp of doing something that Kolchak was doing, but it missed some of the charm that Kolchak had. And I think that's part of the reason why it also fell by the wayside.
Yeah, I felt like both for The Sixth Sense and a little bit for Sweet Sweet Rachel, there was a kind of excessive earnestness. There was a level of melodrama that could have used a little Darren McGavin snide, rough comment here and there. But
yeah, though The Sixth Sense and Sweet Sweet Rachel, the first time we see the psychic investigators, it's all to do with those cards with the stars and the squares, the same things we saw when we're introduced to, I think it's Venkman in Ghostbusters, and this whole thing of like with the wavy lines and those things.
Clear your head. All right? Tell me what you think it is.
Is it a star?
It is a star. Very good. That's great. That's 5 for 5. You can't see these, can you?
No.
You're not cheating me, are you?
No, I swear they're just coming to me.
Though you get the one guy who's watching a football game, and then there's a woman in another room who's kind of narrating the football game. I'm like, okay, I've never seen that one before, but whatever floats your boat.
Well, so those labs were real. So I was really fascinated by it, because when I was rewatching the movie, I was thinking, oh, they're by using like these exteriors of UCLA and everything, they're legitimizing this idea of parapsychology as like a real study. But there was actually a parapsychology lab at UCLA, which was established in 1969 by an actress, actually, who became a psychologist and a parapsychologist named Thelma Moss. And it ran for 10 years without UCLA funding, but it was there on their property. And they did all kinds of testing and some ghost hunting, actually. One of her assistants claimed to have psychic phenomena abilities, and he and somebody else actually went and they would go to haunted, quote unquote, haunted houses and investigate them. And they weren't the only. I think Duke University and Princeton also had labs that were similar, and the government was getting involved. I think it was called Project Stargate.
Have you ever heard of remote viewing? It's a fascinating concept that the U.S. government explored through a program called Stargate. This program was declassified by the CIA and aimed to develop psychic soldiers. Why? Because they discovered Russia was investing millions in their own psychic program. Stargate was an attempt to see if the US could harness these abilities too. But here's the exciting part. Remote viewing isn't just for spies. It's a skill that all humans can learn with practice and focus. Imagine tapping into your intuition and seeing beyond the physical realm.
I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, but it was established around the same time to compete with Soviet research into psychic phenomena. And it was very contentious because they were spending money on this crazy idea. All this stuff that we see at the beginning of Sweet Sweet Rachel is really fascinating to me, because I didn't realize that it was like there was like a real thing happening. I knew the occult was really popular in popular culture, mediums and all that stuff was really hitting its stride. But I had no idea that there were actual like these labs in universities, and much less the government starting a whole whatever department to investigate this stuff. It was so fascinating. So in a way, that part is rooted in, and I don't know how their testing is working, how they did it actually, but it's rooted in some form of reality. And that's I would love to go back to that idea that the unknown is worthy of academic research to the degree that it was. I feel like that's something that's really missing in our modern times.
The Duke Lab, which was one of the first at the university, goes back to 1935. And even before that, in the 1920s, Scientific American was offering, I want to say $10,000, which was a huge amount of money at the time, for anyone who could prove the supernatural life after death or psychic powers in a way that couldn't be explained. And twice they almost gave the money. And the person who stopped it was the one non-academic on the committee, Harry Houdini, kind of led a one-person crusade against spiritualism. But if I can add one more historical note, because I think it ties back to a great point Amanda and Mike you were talking about earlier. If you go back to the kind of modern spiritualism, right? This is not the old folklore or religion, but this kind of the first wedding of folklore and science and this idea, it really, really probably could be dated back to 1848 in Hydesville, New York, which is just down the road from me in Syracuse, just near Rochester, New York, where two sisters, the Fox sisters, claimed that there was mysterious rapping, knocking noise that would answer their questions. And people came, the sheriff came, other folks came, and it became quite a big media sensation. It was covered by papers. They actually did a lecture tour where the girls went out and explained this mysterious Mr. Splitfoot, as they called him, who would answer their questions. Died down. And then what really brought it back was the Civil War. And so as the mass death and destruction of the Civil War hit, families, especially throughout the North, desperate to have any sense that their loved ones were alive, or if they passed, they died, that they were okay. Suddenly there were spirit mediums everywhere. And a lot of those spirit mediums were tied into what I'll call pseudoscientific research. I'm not saying there's no scientific research, but at the time it was like copper wires and telegraphs could be used. And a lot of the episodes of The Sixth Sense used elements of that early period. So there's an episode of The Sixth Sense where they use spirit writing, which is a very popular form of spirit medium from that time. The point I wanted to make was there is something about our interest in the unknown, and particularly the prospect of life after death or something beyond this world, that really expands during times of cultural trauma and turmoil. And it's worth remembering, while Sweet Sweet Rachel is oblique, the first episode of The Sixth Sense is about a prisoner in Vietnam who's sending psychic messages back to his family. So 1971, 72, America's not a very happy place. We've got a lot of death. This is post-Tet Offensive. The Vietnam War is clearly not going to be one. Even Cronkite has said the war is unwinnable. So it's not entirely surprising that Americans would want to start thinking, is there something more? Is there something bigger?
Yeah, there's this idea of trying to make sense of the irrational the best way that you can. And I think you're right. During times of war and hardships, everything feels really irrational. So why not turn to the irrational to try to find the answer?
I remember when we were talking about Rosemary's Baby, the whole thing about Is God Dead, the famous Time cover from 1966. And, that whole movie plays into this whole spiritual void. There's talks about, the Pope coming over to America. And, of course, we've got the Witches' Coven and all these things right there in the heart of New York. I mean, 1973, just a little bit after this, I think it's the first appearance of Uri Geller on The Tonight Show. I'm glad we're all of very similar ages, because the 1970s were a really weird freaking time when it came to the whole idea of like psychics and spiritualism and just having psychics on TV all of the time. It felt like certain shows, like I want to say even like Real People and those types of shows, would always have a little bit of a psychic spin to them as well. This kind of movie playing with psychic phenomenon and science just really hits that sweet spot of what we're going to see through so much of the 1970s.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, do you guys know about Jane Roberts and Seth? Jane Roberts was this woman. She was really ill for many years, and she supposedly was able to channel this medium, or the spirit, I'm sorry, she was like the medium for it, named Seth. Of all, I don't know why your spirit named Seth. You sound like a surfer to me, but okay, go for it. And her husband recorded all of their conversations, so Seth would come out through her and talk. And she wrote books. I have one of her books, actually, and they're self-help books. It's like Seth came out and told you how to live your life in like a fuller way. It was fascinating. And she died, and her papers got donated to either Harvard or Yale. And it so goes back to this legitimization of these weird things like occulty, unknown, supernatural, metaphysical things that were like being taken very seriously in like academia, I guess to some degree, maybe parts of the science world. And yeah, you're right. This is such an interesting time for that. And TV movies reflected that in many different ways. But now that we're talking about Vietnam and thinking about this idea of grief and the Rachel, I'm starting to see it in a bigger way in this movie than I think I had previously.
Yeah, there's a lot of family stuff in this movie, a lot of strange things in this. I remember writing in my notes yesterday when I was rewatching this, I was promised Pat Hingle, and I didn't get Pat Hingle for the longest time in this movie. And then when he shows up, I'm just like, what the hell is going on here? Especially the introduction of him where he's drinking wine and eating fried chicken. And then his daughter comes to visit him. The daughter who they say at first that it's her voice on the phone when, I guess we should say that this begins with a murder/suicide of Stefanie Powers' husband, who sees her outside of his window, but it looks like a graveyard, and she's behind a gate and she's reaching for him through this gate, and he goes to run to her and jumps or crashes through this window. And when they start to investigate it, she goes, she's gone to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist says, we need different help. They go to this lab, like you're saying, and they talk with Dr. Lucas Darrow, played by Alex Dreier. And they are asking more. I think, don't they hypnotize her to get more information out of her?
Mm-hmm. I think so, yeah, because she goes back. And then that's the part where Lucas Darrow starts to see what she sees, or what she's remembering. And then he goes to the window and almost falls through it too. And then the psychiatrist who's not in touch with this other realm, can't see what he's seeing. So he throws something through the window to break up the image, which I guess, sure. And then he saves Lucas Darrow, whose life is in peril 8 times in this in many, many different ways. He's so in touch with the other side that it's like he just leaves an open door for the culprits to come in and be like, hey, crash your car. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I was thinking, Amanda, the whole time I was watching, I was thinking, it's not that these other people are powerful psychic. It's that Darrow is just like this sponge going like you think, oh, have a sandwich. I must have a sandwich. Like he's just, everybody gets him.
Well, yeah, even to show him in a flashback when he's first getting contacted psychically, he's performing surgery and someone in another room is having a fit, and he just starts to see all this stuff in the middle of surgery. And it's like, dude, boink out of it. Somebody's here on the table open in front of you. You really need to pay more attention. But yeah, they eventually hypnotize her, get a little bit more out of her as far as who was trying to reach out to her, who was on the phone, because she picks up the phone afterwards, after her husband has jumped to his death, and sees all of these tarot cards, the tarot cards that you read out at the beginning, Amanda. And she's like, well, I think the voice was my cousin Nora. So it starts this whole idea of, was it her cousin? Meet her mother, who's played by Louise Latham, doing a fantastic job in that. And then eventually, like I was saying, we get to meet Pat Hingle as her father, not Stefanie Powers', but cousin Nora, who's played by Brenda Scott. And that intro of him, and again, not necessarily reaching through a gate, but they're divided by kind of a gate. And it almost looks like either he or she are in prison. And the way that she keeps calling him daddy really was creeping me out.
Daddy's girl has her glasses on. That's good, baby. That's good.
Daddy, I'm here. What is it you want?
Just want to look at you and talk to you and tell you I love you.
I hate this place. I can almost feel Paul here. I can't stay. What do you want?
I want you to talk to your mother. I want you to make her listen to reason.
Yeah, he's like, you wore your glasses. And she looks so different. Like when they first go to visit her on the boat, she's on this boat with like all these kind of hippie people. And there's this woman with those weird symbols that have like little puffs on them so they don't actually make sound. And she's dancing and they go and visit her. And Brenda Scott's a very beautiful woman, just like Stefanie Powers. But when she gets those glasses on, she reverts into something else. It's a really interesting performance. And I like that scene so much with Pat Hingle because one of the things that's also in this movie that stood out to me rewatching it for this is this idea of class issues. And it's so based in that. And Pat Hingle's character really, like, without saying it verbally, is like saying, look at what class I come from and look where we are now. And I love the look on I don't know what he is, the guy who takes care of the house, the butler guy, is watching him eat. And he's very like blank faced, but you could tell he's completely disgusted by what Pat Hingle's doing. And it's one of my favorite scenes in the movie.
It's an interesting, as a kind of feminist text of the 1970s. The women are treated horribly. Aunt Lillian dies. Nora is forced to kill people. Our poor, sweet, sweet Rachel is like almost killed on multiple occasions. And it's all because Pat Hingle deserves more than he got. But I can't help but feel like it also fits in with some of that early feminist messaging, because these are all women who are being kept and manipulated by either by the Pat Hingle or in some ways by the psychiatrist as well. Darrow's unrelenting, I must solve this case, I must come rescue you, is a little unsettling, almost as unsettling as Pat Hingle's character kissing his daughter's hand and saying, be good for daddy. There's a certain creep level to this. I'm not sure it was necessarily meant this way, but I'm wondering if some of those women watching this in 1971 who'd maybe been to some consciousness raising groups weren't looking at this and going, oh, yeah, I see what's going on there.
Television in general was a woman's venue. It was the main demographic is women aged 18 to 49. And the TV movie really played up to it in a lot of ways. And when you watch TV genre films, a lot of it's coded into the text, these feminist messages. And there's a wide variety in what the messages are. It can be very mixed. But something like Night Terror with Valerie Harper, where she plays this kind of really hapless housewife who finds herself traveling across the desert by herself after her husband's so worried that she can't do something as simple as get on a road and meet him somewhere. And she ends up running across this like hired killer, and she sees him kill somebody, and then it's a chase film. And throughout the film, she grows as a person and is able to take care of herself and stay one step ahead of the killer. And at the very end of the film, she says, now there's two versions of the film, and I can't remember which version it has, but in one of the versions of the film, she says to her husband, and he's like, oh, he doesn't know exactly what's happened to her. And he says, oh, it must have been so hard for you to go across the desert or whatever by your little self. And she said, I'm not Gloria Steinem, not yet. And that's how the movie ends. And it's clearly calling to mind. But then there's movies like Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, where that woman is like just tortured throughout the whole film, and it doesn't end well for her. And it's coded text about what it's like to be a woman being forced into a certain role in society. And The Strange Position of Mrs. Oliver does, like all of these TV movies do that. And Sweet Sweet Rachel is so interesting because I hadn't thought about Lucas Darrow as being this overpowering figure, but this idea of male authoritarian figures ruling over, and the father would be considered one as well, overseeing these two girls and manipulating them. It's a really interesting balance of when is it okay and when isn't it, because I think Darrow's more well-meaning about it. But it's also unfortunate because in so many of these movies like Night Terror, Valerie Harper saves herself. And that's what makes the movie so empowering for me, watching it as a kid, which I saw 10,000 times in the 70s. But in this movie, it's like a man has to save Stefanie Powers and in a way save Nora. And so, yeah, it is very mixed messaging, but I do think women probably tapped into a lot of this stuff when they were watching these TV movies. I think the audience is much smarter than they got credit for.
No, I totally agree. And I wonder if that might also be the reason for the Freud quote at the beginning, because obviously when we think about Freud, it's all about family dynamics and repression and desire and control. And this film is full of that, whether it's a sort of pseudo-Oedipal complex or all these other things going on. I'm wondering if that doesn't thing that very smart viewer Amanda's talking about to think, okay, this is not just a ghost story. Like there's dynamics working here. And the film does a pretty interesting job of playing with those.
Well, there's also tension too, because the feminist movement hated Freud because the woman always ended up being the problem, and so to introduce it in a film that's primarily about this woman in jeopardy is like fascinating to me. And I didn't really know that Freud had kind of interest in parapsychology until recently, prepping for this, but it's such a fascinating element and one that I have to think more about. But yeah, I think that quote clearly means something more. And I think you're right. I think the audience can see it in a couple of different ways and kind of figure out where they want to go from there. So it's a really interesting addition.
The audience might have been a lot smarter than me, because it took me 2 viewings to really realize that there's, you're talking about class differences. I didn't realize that there was money behind a lot of this stuff and this whole idea of inheritance and who's going to end up with the money. And I'm just like, that completely blew by the first time. And I really didn't grasp that. I was just like, oh no, they're just trying to control her. They really want to get her under their control. Again, kind of almost like a Rosemary's Baby type of thing where it's, oh no, Louise Latham, takes her away and, she comes back and she's like, oh, I'm so much happier now. Everything's so great. And I'm like, oh boy, she must have really done a number on Stefanie Powers' head to make her so different and so accepting of the Louise Latham character. It just was really funny to see that and that whole change of her. And then when they get her alone in the house and it's the whole, mom, dad, daughter dynamic, and then Powers up in the almost up in the attic, but up in the upstairs where she is, you know, slowly starting to break out of that. I was like, oh, okay, yeah. I really didn't think that they were gunning for any sort of money for the longest time.
It's definitely power. I think either way you look at it, it's a power dynamic that in coming at her in a bunch of different ways. And how do we control this woman, and how do we manipulate her, not only through orchestrating the death of her husband, but what happens afterwards, because she's clearly really grief-stricken. So she's at this weak point. That's interesting too, because there's another TV movie. Sorry, I hate to keep referring to them. TV movies are my thing. But there's a movie called She Cried Murder with Linda Day George about a woman who's widow, and she's getting back into the modeling world or whatever, and she witnesses a murder, and she calls the police, and the police arrive, and it's the killer, is the cop. It's Telly Savalas. And he realizes that she's seen him and can identify him. And she's like, I don't remember what I saw, but the whole time they're painting her like her friend or a relative who's helping her out is like, oh, she's grieving and she's hysterical and all this stuff. But she, like Valerie Harper's character, stays one step ahead of Telly Savalas throughout the whole film. And to get back to, I think I'm losing your point, but like this idea of there's just power. It's about how do we control these women who are at a point in their life when they have options. They don't have to just be a wife or mother or whatever. And how are we able to rein that in? What is the tension that arises from that? And I think a lot of these TV movies are metaphors for that. So however you want to see it, it's power.
Well, it so reminds me of Death Car on the Freeway, or is it Death Car on the Highway? And just this
Death Car on the Freeway,
yeah, like stay off the roads, ladies. Stay home. Don't go out and get a job.
Yeah, they totally say, like, one woman almost gets run off the road, or maybe she gets run off the road, and they're having this press conference, and I think it's Peter Graves, and he's like, she had traffic tickets. And the woman, the anchor or the news reporter is like, so you're blaming her for, and they actually relate the whole movie, and that's where I think Death Proof was inspired. Quentin Tarantino's Death Proof got inspiration from, because they're using the car as like a form of rape in the movie, and the way they hit the women and the power that they have, and then the people that are supposed to be investigating the case are blaming the women for being quote unquote bad drivers. And so, yeah, it's fascinating, these things. And that was a Hal Needham movie. You would never think Hal Needham would have these very political feminist films, but there you go. And so like the 70s was full of all of these. And so they're really fascinating. And this movie falls right in line with all of them.
One of my favorite shows, Columbo, the writer of this also wrote one of my favorite episodes, How to Dial a Murder. And that kind of fits in with this, with the whole idea of, you know, spoilers for Columbo, but being able to call something, well, I guess they show the murder right off the bat, right? Being able to call and give some keywords in order for these dogs to attack somebody. Very similar with this whole psychic reading of those tarot cards. And you're just like, well, who's the one that read those? And there's a lot of very powerful phone calls in here. And it's basically like reaching out and touching someone with these very bad intentions. And one thing I want to point out too, or talk about a little bit too, is the meeting of Stefanie Powers with her cousin. Just how wild that gets, and the screaming match that they get into is just over the top. I kind of love it because it feels much more like real life. It is not this kind of sedate, well, I was in love with your husband first kind of thing. They just go at it like nobody's business. And you get to see that hatred of one character with another.
You want to know who killed Paul? Well, I'll tell you, it was her. She killed him. You killed him, Rachel, because you couldn't stand knowing that he loved me. You couldn't stand it, and you killed him. No, I always did. He always did. It was I never do that. Rachel. It was never you. It was always me. She took him and she pushed him out that window. No, I did. You killed him, Rachel. He loved me more than anybody in the world. You killed him. You killed him. You killed him because he loved me.
I think it's really good, but she gets right up to the border of, because like when the aunt dies and she's blaming Lucas Darrow for it, and she's reaching out, like she's by the pool where they found the aunt, and Lucas Darrow's on this balcony, and she's pointing at him, and she's just screaming, and she's right at the edge of total insanity. And there's so many actresses I can see in my head that I won't say that could have not done that. And she keeps you with her, but it's a real tough character because there is so much of her that we don't get to know her very well, except to know her hysteria. And so it's really tough. And she still keeps you on her side through the whole thing.
I think I agree. It's a great performance that could have definitely been clunky or painful to watch. But I also love that, and I think this is one of the things that the film does, and I think a lot of the sort of television work around horror in the 1970s and late 60s is doing, is recycling these earlier literary tropes. The mad woman in the attic, the hysterical lone widow or woman. So this is the turn of the screw. It's the yellow wallpaper. And what I like about Powers' performance throughout this is you are constantly left to think maybe she's just nuts, or maybe it's her. Maybe she's being driven. Maybe she's just making this all up. So you're kind of left with that sort of unreliable narrator and trying to work your way through it. And then, of course, when you add Nora, it adds this additional layer of tension. And there's also that kind of hysteria and sexual tension and all that sort of work, which to me just goes right back to that Freud quote. I was set up for this from the beginning.
Well, you get that great spooky graveyard image through the window and the old gate that she's trying to come through. But then that the actual place of death is the rocks with the waves coming in. I mean, it's so Rebecca as far as how that goes. I mean, talk about another great classic Gothic type of horror film. I mean, we've seen people fall to their deaths off of big rocky cliffs in Gothic horror and melodrama for years, and that they just happen to live right on this cliff face is fantastic.
Yeah, I thought maybe it was just Louise Latham was triggering it in me, but there are two figures I think loom behind this production. Maybe they're haunting it. One is Hitchcock. And I think all of that, is she crazy? Is she not? All that up and down the stairs, all that use of architecture to tell story. That's so Hitchcock. It's Hitchcock. And I think for audiences at the time, Hitchcock was still alive making films and was very much resonant in popular culture. I think they would have picked that up. The other that I feel like should at least be mentioned is Dan Curtis. And especially that opening was so dark shadows. I was wondering, is Barnabas Collins going to hop out from behind the rocks and say, boo, I got you. So I felt like there was definitely some pinging on some of that other popular culture horror stuff that was going on at the time.
Well, in 1969, there was a unsold pilot called Darkness That Blazed On, which you might be familiar with, which is a Dan Curtis production. They used the sets from Dark Shadows. It's shot on video, directed by Leela Swift. And it stars Marge Doucet as this woman who inherits like a Gothic house, and she sees the ghost in the house, and then she hires this parapsychologist and his partner, who's not blind, but it's very similar to this. So yeah, I definitely think Dan Curtis had an influence on him almost directly when you look at the two. They're very different films, but they're also have similar premises. And Marge Doucet's character is not quite as, she's has more agency, I think. But you can see like the roots of it in Darkness That Blazed On. And it's fascinating.
And Dan Curtis is a Syracuse University alum. I'm obligated legally by my contract to point that out whenever there's an SU alum somewhere. So Syracuse University, Dan Curtis, go Orange.
Well, yeah, and also very heavily involved with the early Kolchak stuff as well. And then I believe that one of you two is involved with this new box set that's coming out, Late Night Mysteries from Dan Curtis.
Yeah, I did 2 commentaries for it. Those are like kind of noir-y. They're not more so in this, because they're releasing several Dan Curtis sets, Kino Lorber, and they're all specific to like the classic literature that he adapted. Although like late night shot on video, like crazy stuff. And he did an anthology film called Dead at Night, which is a sort of semi-sequel to Trilogy of Terror. And they're putting Darkness That Blazed on there as an extra. It's really good. But the Late Night Mysteries is noir-y. I don't know how else to crime. And they were for ABC Wide World Mysteries, so they're all shot on video, very stagey looking. They're amazing. I love them. And yeah, so I love Dan Curtis. I have a rat named Dan Curtis, so just so you know, one of my rats is named after him.
All right, let's go ahead and take a break, and we're going to play an interview with Sweet Rachel herself. Sweet Rachel, actually. That is Ms. Stefanie Powers, and we'll be back with that right after these brief messages. Looking for something superior to streaming? A place with more than 5 times the selection available on all the streaming services combined? Select from an unparalleled collection of over 150,000 films and get Blu-rays, 4Ks, and DVDs delivered directly to your door. Get in on it now at scarecrow.com and rediscover the wonders of physical media. Did I read right that you're just coming back from Africa?
Yes.
Another trip out to the preserve?
Yes, and to the foundation, because I was away for 5 months, because we have opened our new laboratory, which is operational. I have to qualify that by saying that our mission statement is wildlife conservation through education and alternatives to habitat destruction. So our focus has been on the education part of it for all these years. We've served over 1 million students of all ages as well as adult groups since we opened our doors in 1982. The education aspect of our enterprise has gone great guns. Last year, we served 14,000 students. That was a little bit more than we could handle at the main education center. We have a pretty constant population in our outreach program, which services 7 communities that are rather impoverished and are outside of our immediate area. That's been a pretty constant number. But the entrance to the education center, the main education center, has been escalating. The demand is so great, it's getting just a little bit more than we can handle because it's a small facility and it's a very simple facility, but it is to the point. We started to try and focus more on the science aspect of it, because what we are doing with our agroecology project is to invite partnerships between universities. And we just completed our very first partnership with Jomo Kenyatta University's Science and Technology School in their microbiology department. So that was 8 weeks that we had these students and the lab technician to help us set everything up and work out some of the bugs and get our program started. It is to be able to provide the science behind the soil regeneration that we are doing through a particular method of recreating biodiversity through a combination of methods of creating a compost, but viable compost that is not just, a bunch of stuff that you take out of the kitchen and put into that's degraded and potential soil fertilizers, but it is not the kind of compost that we need in order to transplant and encourage the return of biodiversity in land that has been over-chemicalized and that has had a great many poor farming techniques. So all of that combined to be teaching and to actually overthrow the old guard's philosophies of how you look at farming in today and in the future, and how you are going to, through your farming methods, sequester carbon and moisture, which you're not going to do if you simply keep doing the same things that have caused us to get in this place in the first place.
You said that this has been going since 82, but how long have you been going to Africa?
Since 1973.
I knew it was a little bit longer before you and Mr. Holden had started the preserve.
He bought the land, and had this vision of what he wanted to do in 1959, long before anybody had the word conservation in their vocabulary, let alone the idea of extinction. But now when you see all the evidence presented to you that we have reduced habitat and continue to reduce habitat at such an alarming rate, that we're no longer providing the planet with enough sufficient greenery to cover the escape of carbon through the soils that are uncovered. So the only way you're going to produce oxygen is through the carbon-oxygen equation. And the less greenery that you have, the least possibility there is to be producing oxygen. So what are we doing? That's science that a grammar school kid learns. And we're so smart. And then, of course, there are all these young people who just graduated university who pay no attention to history and know nothing about it and don't think they have to. Yet there's nothing there that's really interesting to them. I'm sorry, but that is just plain stupid. And so they will learn how important history is when they can't get a job. because they didn't calculate properly because they didn't have any historic understanding, because they didn't pay any attention to history, as if it didn't matter to them. I've heard that generation say, I should know this because like that. I guess, the history of the world happened before you existed. So I guess that's not important. So anyway, there we go.
I was hoping to ask you a little bit about around that same period of time that you first went to Africa, but 1971, it's only been 54 years, but I was wondering if you could tell me what you remember of the movie that you did called Sweet, Sweet Rachel.
We filmed it in this extraordinary house that I had seen for years and years, which was situated in the Palisades. You could see it from the Pacific Coast Highway. It was situated just north of Sunset Boulevard, up in the hills. There's a kind of palisade. There's the Pacific Coast Highway, and then there's the land goes straight up in a kind of palisade on top of which houses are built very near to the edge. And from time to time, the palisade collapses. And we've had a tremendous... So everybody knows that palisade area, whoever lived at the beach, because you drive by it all the time. And so I had on many occasions, I'd lived at the beach. And this house became terribly important because I then didn't know anything about the history of it, and nobody else seemed to know the history. And because history is important. And then one day I received an offer to do a movie for television. And little did I know we were going to be filming in that house. So I learned all about who built the house. It was built in the beginning of the 1920s by someone who was in the fur trade. And they built this fanciful kind of Palladian house, Palladian period house that I think it may still be there, but it was falling off the edge. Part of the property was falling off the edge of the palisade. And we were filling there with ropes in certain areas saying, you can't walk over in this area because it was precariously fragile. We filmed inside it and outside it. And that's the main thing I remember. And it was fascinating. And I was fascinated with the structure and the architecture and the history behind it and what happened to the people that built it. Because it was a very interesting period of time. It was a very prosperous period of time for some people before the 1929 stock market crash. There were no taxes. There was very little regulation. It was after Prohibition and after the First World War, so people were giddy with possibilities, and it was in that climate that house was built. I believe that it was the crash that put the band that built it out of business. That was the beginning of its decline. And then, of course, there was another World War, and so much history had passed, and up until the time that the Palisades started to collapse, which began, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it started to really fall apart in the 1960s. And big collapses of houses coming down off the cliff and everything onto the Pacific Coast Highway was in the 60s.
When you approach a role, whether it be Rachel or any other type of role, what goes into that preparation? How do you prepare to be another person?
It's all the things I like about acting, because the thing I most was interested in as an actor was not being myself. That was least interesting to me. The idea of being able to slip into somebody else's skin to the degree that you could, that you were allowed to or assisted to do so by the director and the script, that was what interested me more than anything else. So I try to find in everything that I've ever done the unusual, or at least the unusual for me, because in many cases, there's one of the things that's a disadvantage about playing leading ladies or leading men consistently in stories is that you don't get a chance to play characters. or to characterize some of the roles we're playing, because you will get a note from the producers or the powers that be saying, make her a little more sexy, or make her a little more this, or a little glamorous, or this. So they want you to be what they expect and not what they don't expect. And there have been a number of my favorite projects which fell on very hard times because the expectation was that I was going to look like whatever their perception of what I should look like, and I didn't. Or the character that I played was, as in Darrow Markham, she was English from a kind of upper class education system, and she grew up in colonial East Africa. So she was a very different person to me. CBS didn't know what to do with it because it did not look like their perception of me, and they did not publicize it. Interestingly enough, it's a shame because it was one of my favorite pieces of work, and it's a great story. And most people don't, because they don't know history. They don't realize that Rachel Markham was the first person, not just woman, to fly the Atlantic solo going west against the headwinds. Lindbergh flew east with a tailwind, so he had to carry a lot less fuel. He wasn't as heavy, and he had more dexterity than the wind was pushing him. She had a much more difficult time, and some of her instruments froze, and she lost altitude, and it was a combination of events, but she was going against a big headwind, and she wound up making it in Nova Scotia, but she crash landed, she nosedove into a field with a farmer, but she made it. And that should have been of interest to people if it had been publicized in the right way, that it would inspire some interest. And so I was very disappointed that they did not see the potential of how they might think out of the box to publicize it, because that's what it's all about. You have to get the message out.
I wanted to ask you about some of the folks that you worked with in Sweet Sweet Rachel. I love Louise Latham, and some of the makeup effects that are on her, where she looks like a ghoul, it's so great, but she seemed so intense in that role. And I was curious what you remember about her.
Louise Latham, my goodness, had a tremendous background, a body of work that was admirable and awesome. From the theater to television and films, she's the consummate professional and a lovely woman. You have to be careful when you work with people you admire, because you get fascinated by their work. You're working opposite them, and then you get fascinated by their work, and you're just watching them. And I did have a good seat. Well, I had the perfect seat. I was front row center, so I could see her, watch her work. And that's always been one of the great joys of being able to work with wonderful performers. It's like a tennis match. A good player makes you better. And especially if they hit the ball back to you. You hit it to them and they hit it back to you. It's a silent rapport, but it's crucial to have. And it's not just all about you. It's a great deal more important about the rapport that you have with your other actors and with the characters that you're playing.
Do you find that the adage that most of acting is reacting, is that very true for you?
Oh, absolutely. If you get a chance to be seen reacting, there is that, because don't forget that ultimately what is on screen is in the hands of the director and the editor and a lot of other people who have opinions. So many of them are insecure in that they need to have something happening on the screen at all times, and they don't get the idea that reacting is sometimes more interesting to not just the character, but the progress of the story.
One other actor that I admired so much that was in Sweet Sweet Rachel was Pat Hingle, and I was curious how that was working with him.
Oh, I worked with Pat. I worked with Pat before and since, and I loved Pat. I'm sure that everybody who ever worked with him had the same feeling.
I wanted to switch topics a little bit. I've been working for years and years on a book about Elliot Gould. And I was curious how it was working with him, especially on Escape to Athena.
Oh, we had a ball. That was one of the worst movies any of us have ever made, but we enjoyed each other so much. And Roger Moore playing the German Nazi was almost too much. It was hard to get through a scene. And Elliot, our little musical number that we did, Elliot is such a natural performer. If we had Song and Dance Man again, he was it. And it was so much fun to work with him. So we talked to each other quite a bit. He's not on the board anymore, but he served for many years on the board of our union. And I had 3 years with him on the board. So we saw each other quite a lot. He's lovely, isn't he?
This is the 45th anniversary of Heart to Heart. And if there's anything that you'll be doing around that.
I'll be having dinner with Wagner tonight. That's a treat. He lives in Aspen, and he comes here every once in a while. So it's always a treat to be able to be here at the same time he is. There's still a great rapport. We still joke and laugh and have the same enjoyment of silly jokes. It was, for many reasons and on many levels, as you can well understand, it was an exceptional time in both of our lives. And for the things that happened to our partners in life, and also the fact that we were working on something that in the very beginning, we had no idea that it was going to be well received. We were working in the dark for the first 6 months, and it was very frustrating and very nervous making that anybody was going to like it. And then went on the air, and it started to build very slowly. It wasn't an overnight success, but when it caught on, it started to really get a following. But once again, we were working in 14 hours a day, and we were in every shot. So we had no feedback. We had no feeling of, yes, they would bring us the ratings, but we didn't know that people actually liked us until I think it was after our first Christmas. It was after our first Christmas, I think it was. We came back from Christmas, our separate Christmas vacations, and all of a sudden we realized, oh my God, we're a success or we're a hit. And we never looked back.
You guys were like a modern day Nick and Nora Charles for me.
That was the point. Yes, that was the hope. And that's what Todd Mankiewicz was able to create. He was able to create that forum for us because he took what was originally an idea called Double Switch that had been written by Sidney Sheldon. And he polished it and rewrote it sufficiently to make it into much more the rapport of Nick and Nora, a much more sophisticated rapport than what was originally thought of. And he brought the dog. He added the dog, Freeway, and Max, who wasn't there in the beginning. And my God, can you imagine us doing this without Max and the dog?
Lionel Sander was just such a treat, especially that voice, that amazing voice of his.
He was quite a character, and talk about history. It was extraordinary to read and understand his history and his battle for freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and what he endured and what he survived. Did you read his statement? It's available in the National Archives. It is public accessible, and it's well worth being able to read.
And then did I also read right that you're about to go on a TCM cruise?
Yes, I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm going to be there with my friend Brenda Vaccaro and my other friend Nancy Kwan, who did a little movie with Bill Holden called The World of CZ Wong. And we've all known each other for years and years. So we will definitely have a giggle. And It sounds, they're going to keep us very busy. We have a huge schedule, but it sounds as if it's truly special. And I was told by a couple of friends who'd done it that the feeling is wonderful on the ship. Everybody is a movie fan and a movie buff, and you're with like-minded people. That's lovely. Can I just add that the William Holden Wildlife Foundation, more information is available for the William Holden Wildlife Foundation on our website, which is whwf.org. And I hope your listeners will take a chance and have a look and see if there's anything that interests them. January, we're going to have a fundraising performance for the William Holden Wildlife Foundation. Robert Wagner and I did almost 500 performances of love letters. It's not something he feels he can do anymore or wishes to do anymore. And so I'm going to do a one-time only performance with my dear friend, with whom I co-starred in McClintock, who starred his father, John Wayne, and Maureen O'Hara, the most wonderful woman. And it was called McClintock. Andy is going to be played by Patrick Wayne. And I'm going to play Melissa. And we'll be doing it at the El Portal Theater in January. I think it's the 11th. Be a matinee performance on the 11th of January. So I hope you'll come and see.
Ms. Powers, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this.
I thank you so much. You're a wonderful interview.
Move down the darkest corridor of the inner mind. ESP is a fact. Across the comprehensions of reality.
Science fiction.
Is it? Beyond the shroud of your subconscious. Back. Farther back. And into the sixth sense.
Come with me.
All right, we are back, and we are talking about Sweet, Sweet Rachel. And we probably should talk about, you mentioned Dr. Simon Tyler's assistant. And it's kind of a shame that there isn't a character like him in The Sixth Sense. I think they changed him to a sighted woman. But to have this blind assistant who can see all of these psychic phenomena as well, it almost reminds me a little bit of Paul Moadib, where he loses his sight, but he can see because he's so tuned in with the spice. But with this, he's so tuned in with psychic phenomena, and he doesn't seem to have too much of a problem getting around. And to have a quote-unquote blind seer is always a really fascinating trope for me.
Yeah, and it's Chris Robinson, too, who is, I guess he'd been in Stanley and he'd done some other stuff, but he would become more famous to me for playing Dr. Rick Weber on General Hospital. He just passed away. As a matter of fact, a bunch of people that worked on this, not a bunch, but a few just passed away within the last couple of years. So some of these people lived a real good long life, but he's terrific. And I don't think the first time I saw this, I actually realized it was him. He looks quite different than he did by the time I got to General Hospital.
All of the people that we've mentioned are pretty much named people. I can't say I'm familiar with Alex Dreier, but then when I looked him up, I was like, oh yeah, I've seen this guy 100 times. I just wasn't aware of what his name was. I was kind of hoping, going back to Dan Curtis, I was kind of hoping for a Simon Oakland type character in this.
Yeah, one of the people, the UCLA executive that they make go over and see what's going on at the lab. And he hates everything.
Just be really angry all the time.
Vincenzo Kolchak? I agree. I do want to add, though, watching this, I do feel like it should be pointed out. So I should say I'm a university professor and also a director of a research center. I cannot break into people's homes just because I want to. I know this is quite shocking to you. Yeah, these are not authority. We don't have the power to frame people for murder. This is literally not something we can do. So I love Darrow's I'm a scientist. I'm with the university. Oh, break on in. Do whatever you want. No big, wreck your car twice. Almost kill your assistant. It's fine. I should point out, since a lot of people are skeptical of higher education these days, this is not something we routinely do. So.
Oh, sure. You just ruin people's minds with your liberal ideas. I love the bit of business when Louise Latham dies and he does that whole thing where he says, I killed her. And he pulls out that vial of poison. And it's like, whoa, what a twist. I did not see this coming. And then that he's using that as a ruse so that they'll dig up the body, exhume the body, and say, no, it is actually arsenic poison. It's not the type of poison you have. And he's just like, whew, good thing I chose this. It's pretty rare, but I would have gone to jail otherwise.
That would have been bad luck.
But also we got Jonathan Hillerman too in like a very small role coming in as like pathologist. Yeah. And it's just like, oh, every time he shows up, I get so excited. I love him. But yeah, it's got its share of twists in it. And that's a really fun one because that was the best way for him, he thought anyway, to get them to exhume the body without having to explain that he realized that there was poison because his psychic assistant got a message that she'd been poisoned. And so it was like a really fun way to like get that body out of its grave.
On the shots of her from beyond the grave, wow, I was not expecting that, especially when she's on the highway and just has that like ghoulish makeup on. And I'm like, man, she already, no offense, but she already looks a little creepy in real life just because of the way that she can really just be that, you know, overbearing Marnie mother. And then for her to show up in this with that fright makeup on, I was like, oh my gosh, I would crash my car if I was that guy too.
That might be a little Night of the Living Dead joining in with the Rosemary's Baby. Which I do think, I just to make one other point, and I think Amanda's kind of made this point already, but horror was in television from its inception, right? Coming out of radio and into the anthology series. But there's such an interest in horror post Rosemary's Baby. And I think also post Night of the Living Dead, both came out in 1968, that you're seeing the networks, just everybody's scrambling for what do we have? What are some options? And ABC was the one that was, wow, willing to swing for the fences on these things.
Yeah, they didn't actually start. You're talking about like the ABC Movie of the Week coming in and making this like a bigger thing because their early days in horror, like obviously they started in 1969 and by 1971 it was Bonzo. But like one of their first horror movies was Daughter of the Mind. And Daughter of the Mind is a really great, creepy ghost story, but it's like half ghost story, half espionage. And I think they weren't sure if the audience was going to be there. So they dipped their toes in it. And then they were like, oh, the way that the ABC, and this was actually an ABC Movie of the Weekend. It aired on Saturday. And that was a 1-year spinoff. That's where Duel originally aired as well. And this was the second movie to air in this series. But because of the kind of the nature of the factory of filmmaking that they had to do to make all of those TV movies, genre had to come in because it already had the established tropes and like they had to have these scripts with ideas already pre-planned. It was like the idea of, and of course now I've totally forgotten his name and I feel really stupid because he's famous, but the guy who created Perry Mason had that wheel. He would spin the wheel and he would get like the 3 plot points that he would need and he would write a book, right? And so ABC Movie of the Week had to do that to produce as many movies as they did, but it turned out audiences loved it. And it also turned out that they had filmmakers like Dan Curtis and John Llewellyn Moxey and John Newland and Sutton Roley who knew how to make these movies very economically, but make them look really beautiful and interesting and understand the subtext that was happening. And yeah, ABC really opened the door for horror in a feature film on television format, that was unimaginable, I think, even before when the TV movie first arose in the mid-60s. So yeah, they did the Lord's work, really.
Parallel to right now, I often think about some of that moment of the movie of the week, that early ABC is what I would call like high concept, low budget, right? So there's a really cool idea, Gargoyles or Night Stalker or Sweet Sweet Rachel. We don't just have a huge budget for it, but we're going to make it work and lean. And I feel like that's where popular cinema is right now in terms of horror films. So like Weapons just came out, and again, $30 million is not a tiny budget. It's overperforming. Same thing with Sinners or the earlier film from the director of Weapons was Barbarian, which is a much lower, but they're high concept. They're like interesting films, even if they're not full of super special effects, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like in some ways that movie of the week was a great early example of that. We can make something work and be a little bit different and interesting, even within the confines of this kind of, as you say, relatively limited budget and limited genre parameters.
Well, yeah, you can look at anything James Wan has done and you can see it rooted. And actually, he was a really big fan of a 1991 TV movie called The Haunted with Sally Kellerman, which is about the Smurl family. And the Warrens are in that. And I don't know if that's where he got introduced to the Warrens, but that movie had a really big effect on him and Lee Whannell. And so, yeah, the TV movie, people, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on here, but people like to poo-poo on it or shit on it. But it really it was a very important moment in television. And all the stuff we see today, there's less with streaming and stuff. People have more creative license to do things. But the TV movie was getting it done on a lot less. Like, I think you hand filmmakers $250,000 to $500,000 now. And I guess you would have to inflate that for whatever. And they wouldn't know how to make something like this. They just wouldn't. And so the talent was there, and the beauty of those kinds of films are there. It's just, it makes me feel so bad that people don't recognize it and don't appreciate it. And it's great that you're doing this movie on here, because you do so many different kinds of movies, but TV movies don't always get their spotlight. So it's really nice to see that.
Great pull on the Warrens. I forgot all about them and just how huge, again, they were in the 1970s and still with us today through the films and, you know, through things like, God, I mean, how many horror movies and how many weirdo knockoff horror movies have the word Amityville in them? And then, you know, like, I think there was like Amityville Shark just recently. I mean, just bizarro stuff that they have. But yeah, going through the list of the TV movie of the week from ABC, just seeing so many titles that I'm so familiar with or that I've managed to track down over the years. I mean, things like How Awful About Alan or Dr. Cook's Garden or Seven in Darkness. I guess there's a lot of blind people on these things. The Last Child, I believe I watched when I was talking about Children of Men or, you know, just so many films that I've heard of or have managed to see. And of course, you know, Duel being the big boss of it all, but you know, Failing of Raymond, Brian's Song. I mean, some of these things just became huge. I mean, I can't say Failing of Raymond became a hit. That was one I had to really track down, but Brian's Song, I mean, that was in every video store I ever worked at.
Oh yeah, it was a huge title. The Night Stalker. Actually, I pulled up the top 15 movies of this season, and The Night Stalker and Brian's Song were 1 and 2. But there's a woman in prison movie, number 3, called Woman in Chains. You talked about The Last Child, which came in at number 8 for the season, and it actually aired 3 days after this. There's a movie called Five Desperate Women with Stefanie Powers. It's a proto-slasher that came in at number 15. I mean, the top 50, She Waits with Patty Duke, which is a great ghost story with a lot of really interesting subtext. And that's half the Taste of Evil with Barbara Stanwyck is in the top 15. So these genre films were huge. And Brian's Song, of course, that just was in the zeitgeist. That just exploded into this craziness. And there were other types of films too, like Gidget Gets Married and Suddenly Single and things like that. Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones, which is based off a novel and stuff. But yeah, and when you think about the audiences, like when you just look at The Night Stalker, for instance, I can tell you that almost half of America watched it on the night it originally aired. 48% of people watching television that night tuned in to watch Darren McGavin hunt down a vampire. And so it was like it's so impressive. And although we talk about superhero movies and stuff being these big things, I'm not sure that as many people that go to superhero movies every time one comes out would even come close to the number of people that sat down and watched The Night Stalker or Rhoda Get Married. There were something like 50 million people or something tuned in for that. JR getting shot. Like, TV's had such a really interesting influence, but the TV movie for some reason has fallen by the wayside. And I think it's because even when they originally were getting produced, they were called B movies and mini movies. Nobody wanted to call them films. And they've always really struggled, despite the fact that audiences really embrace them.
My background is more in film. So I most of my work is in terms of the horror film that's in the silver screen. But one of the reasons I wanted to write the book on Kolchak was because I recognized this was a really important cultural moment in that period, that sort of second golden age of horror in the 60s and 70s. And yet, because it's a TV movie, it's talked about, people know it, but it doesn't get the respect, especially in the academic circles, as being a really important, as important as Last House on the Left or The Exorcist in terms of audience impact, in terms of shaping the culture. And I felt like that needed to be captured. I think the other thing, and I guess I was still thinking about like why Kolchak became well-known and the Sixth Sense TV series, even though it was first faded. I think a big part of it was CBS had purchased that package of old TV shows and were rerunning them on late nights in the late 70s, early 80s. And I think a lot of the people who now talk about Kolchak, The Night Stalker being influential, I bet because of age, I bet they watched it late night CBS. So if The Sixth Sense had been picked up in that package, maybe people would have been talking about that. So part of the point is not only are these TV movies important, but part of the way they get lost is we don't see them. like they're not as available. They're not on every streaming service or on DVD. So the great work Amanda's doing, bring these things back. More power to you. Fight the good fight.
Thank you. I'm actually making a list on my social media where every day I pick a TV movie that's not on DVD or Blu-ray and I spotlight it. And that's 365 movies I'm going to do this year. And there's 5,000 of them. And I'd say it's really easy to pick 365 out of there because only 5 or 10% I think ever really got a legitimate home video release. I think there's more on VHS, but past that, it's really hard. And we're starting to see it more and more, which is like these Dan Curtis releases are amazing. But yeah, it's like this lost piece of cinema. And I think they're starting to come into their own, partially because everything is so available except these movies. So cinephiles are becoming really interested in trying to find these films just to find them because they're so rare. And sometimes they really fall in love with them. And I'm here for it.
To see a cleaned up version of Sweet Sweet Rachel would be such a gift, because I was looking all over and I'm like, I know it was released on VHS in other countries. And that was interesting to see how it was marketed for the other countries. That horror makeup of Louise Latham I was talking about, that's like front and center on a lot of these. So it makes it look like it's a zombie film rather than something else, or like a children shouldn't play with dead things type of movie, or even Dead of Night. And then, thank God for Mod Cinema being able to put stuff out, and then YouTube being a refuge as well for a lot of these films. But to see this, I'm excited to see those Dan Curtis movies just to see really nice prints of them, because a lot of these I've never seen in any sort of decent way.
Yeah, I'm just dying for all these movies to come out. You can tell the Sweet Sweet Rachel had a lot of care put into it. Just the cinematography, from what we can see from pixelated uploads, is really stunning. So we've got a very beautiful cinematic flair to it. And a lot of these movies did. And the movie that aired, the first ABC movie of the weekend, called The Deadly Dream, just came out on Blu-ray. And it was a revelation to me to see it that way. It was just stunning. And it brought out all of that subtext that we're talking about. And it's also like another dreamlike kind of movie with Lloyd Bridges. He's not really sure if he's in a dream or not in a dream. There's like 2 stories happening. And one is, we think it's his real life. And the other one is this dream that's interfering with something. But when you see it cleaned up, you're like, oh, I see all the layers here that they were trying to get across. And it looks beautiful. Nothing looks like that 70s TV movie looked like. Just everything was stunning. And oh my God, it was so good. So I would love to see that happen with this and every one of these films.
All right, we're going to take a break and play a preview for next week's show right after these brief messages.
Comment vous êtes fait ça?
Je suis tombée sur des éléments métalliques dans un chantier à outil, je pense.
Enfin, ça vient pas d'être fait, ça a au moins 3 ou 4 heures. Pourquoi vous avez traîné comme ça?
Qu'est-ce qu'il y a?
T'as la moitié de la jambe arrachée, tu t'en rends pas compte, et là je t'effleure, tu te retournes, tu te grattes, alors...
On a regardé partout dans la chambre, on a trouvé un truc bizarre, il y avait du sang sur le sol dans la salle de bain. On avait peur de tomber sur un cadavre.
Après, j'ai été m'entailler dans le débarras près des archives. Comment tu t'es entaillé? Avec le truc en fer. J'ai compris, mais qu'est-ce que tu faisais avec ce truc en fer? Je m'entaillais. J'ai perdu le contrôle, je suis tombée.
T'es incapable de me donner une explication cohérente. Montre ta main. Ouais, dépêche-toi. Ah, mais d'où ça t'est venu une idée pareille? De quoi t'avais envie de ça?
C'est pas possible, c'est pas toi qui as fait ça. Je t'ai dit, j'ai eu envie. J'ai pas réfléchi, je sais pas pourquoi, j'ai fait une connerie, je la referai pas.
Non, mais je m'en fous de ce que tu comptes faire ou pas. Tu l'avais prévu, ça?
En fait, ça t'a pris comme ça va pas recommencer. Puis sinon, tu peux voir un médecin et prendre un médicament.
Première fois que je vois ça.
Sauf qu'avec ces blessures, il risque de t'envoyer à l'hôpital psychiatrique.
Et ça veut dire que t'as des préoccupations que je connais pas et que je te connais pas.
Bah si, tu me connais. Bah si, tu me connais.
C'est insupportable pour moi de voir ça.
That's right. We'll be back next week with a look at In My Skin. Until then, I want to thank my co-hosts Amanda and Kendall for joining me. Kendall, what's the latest with you, sir?
I've got 2 quick shameless plugs. Sorry, Mike. The first is about 20 years ago, I had a chance to write a book. It was cultural history of the horror film. It was called Projected Fears, Horror Films in American Cultures. And so the wonderful folks at Bloomsbury are bringing it out as a 2nd edition. So this November, just a couple of weeks after this episode airs, Projected Fears, the 2nd edition will be out with new movies, new chapters. So it's basically the history of the American horror film from Dracula to Get Out. And so folks can't check that out. The other, I'm excited and slightly terrified to tell you, my debut novel is a novel called No One Can Save Us, has recently been published by Nightmare Press. It's a blend of horror, science fiction, and superheroes. So think Watchmen meets Lovecraft. So hopefully people can track it down and let me know what they think.
And Amanda, how about yourself?
People can just look for me online on Blue Sky and on Facebook under Made for TV Mayhem, and also Instagram if they want to see what I'm doing. But I restarted my podcast too. My podcast is very sporadic. It's called the Made for TV Mayhem Show. And I just recently we covered it last year. I finally edited it and put it online, but I covered 2 TV movies that I think really deserved a wider audience, and that's The Forgotten Man from 1971, also from this year, with Dennis Weaver, and Welcome Home, Johnny Bristol, which I think came out the following year with Martin Landau, and they're both dealing with coming home from the war. Welcome Home, Johnny Bristol deals with fantasy, but the first one's just a straight drama about this guy's life. He's like a prisoner of war guy, and he comes back and everything's different. Like his wife's remarried, they thought he was dead, and so his whole life has been ripped out from him, and it becomes a thriller at the end. It's really interesting, but Dennis Weaver's great in it. And then Welcome Home, Johnny Bristol is about this guy who comes home from a war, and he wants to go back to his home, which is this place called Charles, Vermont, but nobody can see Charles, Vermont on any map. And when he goes to find it, it's not there anymore. And the story is, where is Charles, Vermont? What happened to it? And so it's really interesting. It's dealing with the trauma of the war, but actually the trauma from previous. And it's a really fascinating film. It was really interesting. But it feeds into this Vietnam thing and this idea that this movie is actually loosely dealing with Vietnam through the idea of grief and using the irrational to make sense of things. So it's tied in a very tangentially way.
Well, I'll be sure to check out that episode and track down those movies. They sound great. Thank you so much, folks, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Want to support physical media and get great movies in the mail? Head over to scarecrow.com and try Scarecrow Video's incredible rent-by-mail service. The largest publicly accessible collection in the world, you'll find films there entirely unavailable elsewhere. Get what you want when you want it without the scrolling. If you want to hear more of me shooting off my mouth, check out some of the other shows that I work on. They are all available at weirdingwaymedia.com. Thanks especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join the community, visit patreon.com/projectionbooth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.